Good morning, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to the March 29th special meeting of the Finance and Audit Committee. I'd like to first recognize that we are gathered on the traditional territory, the Snuneymuxw First Nation. Our clerk today will be Ms. Sheila Gurry. Today's special Finance and Audit Committee meeting will be held in accordance with the Community Charter and Council Procedure Bylaw 2018, number 7272. Question period sign-up sheet is on the table by the double doors to my left for agenda items only. If during the meeting any member of the gallery has a question regarding agenda item, please write down your name and the agenda item on the sheet. Members have been granted permission to attend electronically. And so far this morning, we have Councillor Perino with us electronically. Good morning. And mercifully, of course, we have a quorum, which is most important. And Ms. Gurry, the first item is the introduction of late items, and we have a few, please.
Yes, thank you, and good morning. So for agenda item 6B, Large Capital Projects Overview, we have the addition of the presentation titled Large Capital Projects Overview. And for agenda item 6D, Harewood Artificial Turf Field, tender results and next steps, we're removing that item on this agenda, Your Worship. And that's everything.
Thank you very much, and welcome also to Councillor Gesselbrock, who's joined us electronically. A motion for adoption of the agenda is amended. Moved Councillor Thorpe, seconded Councillor Hemmons. All those in favour? Any opposed? None. Motion carries. We have no minutes to adopt. We have no presentations, no delegations. And the first item is reports. 7A, Draft Debt Management Policy. Good morning, Ms. Mercer. Welcome. The floor is yours.
Okay, good morning. So I'll be talking about our draft debt management policy this morning. So I'll walk you through the presentation as follows. So we'll start out with a brief discussion on municipal debt, so external, internal, and who we borrow from. Then we'll give an overview of the city's debt, so our current debt and what's projected currently in the financial plan, and a little bit about why the city borrows. So, and then we'll wrap it up with some discussion around the debt policy that we have drafted and why we did that. So first we'll talk about external debt. So under the community charter, municipalities may utilize external debt to fund capital investments. So we can obtain short-term debt, and that is classified as any debt with a term of 5 years or less. And equipment financing is an example of a type of short-term debt that we have utilized at the city. And we have long-term debt, and that is usually has a term of 20 years, but can be as long as 30. So borrowing can only be used for items of a capital nature, so a building or certain types of infrastructure, and the term must be shorter than the life of the asset being constructed or purchased. So if you had a building that was had a useful life of 15 years and you were going for a 30-year borrowing, you wouldn't be allowed to do that. So for long-term borrowing and for some short-term borrowing, you need electoral approval to get this, and you get this by either holding a referendum, which is what we did for this building, the conference center, or using an alternative approval process, and we did that for Fire Station number 1 borrowing. So Ms. Gurry will go through these both in more detail in a later presentation. So, and as we've mentioned many times in our finance presentations, you cannot exceed your debt servicing limit. So we'll talk about that a little later in the presentation as well. So under Section 189 of the Community Charter, it allows municipalities to borrow internally under certain circumstances. So a municipality may borrow from one statutory reserve to another to fund projects. So there is no requirement for repayment for internal borrowing, and all the community charter says is that the money must be repaid by the time the reserve needs the funds. And it must be repaid with interest. So statutory reserves accumulate interest, so you have to pay the money back with interest. So an example is in 2018, we borrowed money from the Drainage DCC Reserve to fund a DCC sewer project for the Chase River Pump Station and Force Main, and we're paying that back over 20 years at 2%. Interest rates were a little nicer in 2018 than they are now. So a municipality can also borrow money from operating reserves. And again, there's no repayment terms through the community charter, but we would pay it back. But the difference between operating reserves and statutory reserves is you don't have to pay it back with interest. So the Municipal Finance Authority of BC provides short-term, long-term, and equipment financing to communities and public institutions in BC. And for long-term borrowing, there are 2 borrowing intakes a year through MFA BC, one in the fall and one in the spring. And all the city's long-term debt must be facilitated through the Regional District of Nanaimo. So this means that all of our external debt payments must be paid to the regional district, and then the regional district turns around and pays the MFABC, and that's required under legislation. So in order to obtain long-term debt financing through MFABC, the city must follow certain specific steps, and that includes council's approval and adoption of a loan authorization bylaw, and approval from the Inspector of Municipalities, and then ultimately electoral approval. For short-term and equipment borrowing, generally there are less stringent rules in obtaining this debt. You can borrow at any time of the year. The RDN doesn't facilitate that debt, and you need council approval through a resolution and or a bylaw. So there's just a little bit of difference between the 2 of them. So now I'll give you a bit of an overview over what we currently have for city debt, and a little bit why do we borrow. So the city uses borrowing as a funding strategy when reserves and other funding sources are not adequate to fund the total cost of the capital investment. So external long-term debt has primarily been used to fund facilities in the past. So, and I'll note that usually borrowing isn't the only funding source for these projects. So for example, for Fire Station number 1, we used a combination of borrowing and funds from the General Asset Management Reserve to fund the entire project. So over the last 20 years, we've borrowed for the Nanaimo Aquatic Center, the Nanaimo Port of Nanaimo Center, this building, the water treatment plant, and Fire Station number 1 and number 4. So debt can also debt can also be used to fund capital investment portion of implementing a new service delivery change. So this, the city used short-term debt to purchase carts and new automated garbage trucks when automated garbage collection came on board. So the debt term for that was 5 years, and it was done through the MFA's equipment financing program. And we continue to use that equipment financing program to fund our purchase of new garbage trucks. So as I mentioned in the earlier slide, if the city has excess funds in a statutory reserve, we can borrow from one reserve to pay for another's projects. So we have collected more money than we currently need in the DCC Drainage Reserve, and we have a funding shortfall for DCC sewer projects. So we have, under the community charter, as long as we pay it back with interest, we can borrow from one fund to pay for another. So at December 31st, 2022, the city had approximately $41.3 million in outstanding external debt, and all of those are listed here. So we had 2 outstanding borrowings, and these were short-term debt for the sanitation garbage trucks, and those pay out in 23 and 25, and the funding source for that is sanitation user fees. The Vancouver Island Conference Centre has 2 borrowings. One pays out in 2026, the other in 2027, and the funding source for that one is taxation. Fire Station number 4 will pay out in 2027, and again, that funding source is taxation. We have 2 borrowings for the water treatment plant, and one pays out in 2033 and the other in 2034, and water user fees are the funding source for that debt. And the most recent is our multiple borrowings for the Fire Station number 1, and that debt is funded through the General Asset Management Reserve Fund. As well, as you can see, we have 2 outstanding internal borrowings, and these are funded from the Drainage DCC Reserve Fund. So we have some new debt included in the current financial plan, so the 2023 to 2027 financial plan. So we are anticipating some property purchases in 2023 to be funded from short-term borrowing, and currently the planned 5 years of debt repayment will become from taxation. The city has 3 sanitation trucks arriving in 2023, and these will also be funded from short-term debt through the equipment financing through BC or MFA BC. And we are anticipating 2 internal borrowings for DCC projects, one in 2023 for the Millstone Trunk South project, and one in 2024 for the Millstone Trunk Central. So that is all we have currently planned in our current financial plan. The next presentation will provide you with an update on the 4 projects listed here. And they are all in various stages of planning, but they have not been added to the current financial plan. And the main source of funding for these projects is borrowing. So I won't spend any time on these right now because you'll get more information in the next presentation, but I will just say that these are currently not in our any of our plans that I'm presenting to you. And as you've seen many times in our presentations, under legislation, the city cannot borrow beyond its allowable limits. So based on the city's 2021 financial statements, the annual debt servicing limit is $47.2 million. So this means that the city can have a maximum of $47.2 million in annual payments annual principal and interest payments per year. So for 2021, the debt repayment totaled $6.3 million, or 13% of our maximum limit.
And Ms. Mercer, if I may, just for my own satisfaction, controllable and sustainable revenues. Controllable would obviously be property taxes. That's pretty straightforward, et cetera. But what do we regard as uncontrollable, if you will? Is it, for instance, revenue from the pool, revenue from the aquatic?
Yes. So revenues from the aquatics, any user fees, those are considered controllable and sustainable. I don't believe things like grants or I'm just trying to think off the top of my head what, there are certain types of revenue. So they consider interest a sustainable, uncontrollable, so in the calculation. So there's some that we control how much we invest to a certain extent, but we don't control interest rates. So, but they do consider that part of that calculation. So there are things that kind of anything we don't get on a regular basis. I don't think private contributions are considered sustainable and things like that. There isn't a lot, but sorry, I'm trying to look at the calculation in my mind. But the biggest chunk is property taxes, anything we collect as a user fee, and interest. Those are kind of the big ones that are considered controllable and sustainable.
Thank you. Councillor Manley.
Thank you, Your Worship. Yeah, through you to Ms. Mercer. So with the convention center, the user fees for this center for conventions, et cetera, would that be considered one of the part of the repayment, or is that strictly taxes that's paying for this building?
Through Your Worship, to Councillor Manley, can you rephrase your question? I didn't quite get it.
Okay, so when you were mentioning the convention center,
Yep.
You said it was being repaid through taxes. So
Yep.
just on that thread of controllable and sustainable revenues, are convention fees and user fees for this building helping to pay down that debt?
In a roundabout way, yes, because those go into our ability to, they are taken into consideration when we're collecting taxes to pay for that. So yes, it does reduce the amount of taxation that we do need.
They roll into general revenue?
Yes, it all goes into general revenue, and that pays for the debt, yeah.
And then just one more question, if I may. The interest rates, those are just basically bank rates or standard rates. So when we're borrowing from one reserve fund from another, if we'd borrowed from a reserve fund several years ago, it would be pretty favorable, but now we would be paying the current bank rate, is that correct?
Yes, so when we borrowed for the example I gave from 2018, we haven't updated that rate. But that's how we're paying it back over those years.
Okay.
Yeah.
it's all going into the same.
Your worship, just a clarification, and perhaps Ms. Mercer can speak to that. We don't go by bank rates for the MFA, has its own set of rates. So
Okay.
it's a preferred rate, so you might want to clarify that.
Yes. So when we look at, so when we give any kind of projection on the, what the debt cost will be, so when the next presentation you're going to see, we've tried to estimate what the cost of the repayment of the debt is for those large major capital. We do the, there's a rate that the MFA gives out for their long-term debt and short-term debt, and the ministry requires us to use that rate when we provide estimates of the cost of debt.
Okay.
So we go through the MFA to get our rates because they are more favorable than going out to market.
Great. Thanks.
Councillor Thorpe, please.
Well, thank you, Your Worship, and through you, and my question was for the benefit of viewers, and Ms. Mercer's just answered it, and that my question was to be, as Councillor Manley brought up, we are required for long-term borrowing to use the Municipal Finance Authority, and we can't just go out and borrow elsewhere for long-term debt, and they give us a preferred rate.
That's correct.
And when they approve or look at any long-term borrowing for a municipality, aside from the debt limit, do they make any other judgments on the reason for the borrowing? Do they examine the particular project, or do they just assume that it's needed?
Right. So by the time it gets to MFA, the Inspector for Municipalities has already approved that debt. So as long as we've ticked all the boxes in that process and it passes through the regional district, we get the money.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you, please.
Okay. So as I was saying, the ceiling limit of the currently, which is 47.2, and this calculation is, as Your Worship pointed out, is based on city revenues, and revenues generally increase by each year. So this limit will increase over time as well. And we will update you with the revised amount once the 2022 financial statements are completed. But until that point and the number is calculated, this is what we use as our limit. So in recent years, when we compare ourselves to similar sized and local communities, Nanaimo sits in the middle of the pack with regards to our debt servicing limit. So at December 31st, 2021, our utilization rate, like I said, was 13.4%. And as you can see, other municipalities have chosen different choices for their debt limits. So Ladysmith is the highest at 37.5%, while Parksville is the lowest at 7%. And yeah, so we're kind of in the middle of the pack as far as our utilization for 2021. This graph shows how Nanaimo compares to those other municipalities with regards to debt per capita for 2021. Now, debt per capita is calculated as the outstanding debt balance for the year divided by the population. So for 2021, Nanaimo had a debt per capita of $451. Ladysmith had a high at 1,854, and Saanich had a low of 384. So this graph gives you a historical look at the actual outstanding debt and the debt per capita information for the city from 2000 to 2022. So the highest debt level the city had was in 2014 at just over $50.8 million. And this was when we took on some debt for the water treatment plant, and it started in 2013. So that's where you see the bit of the highest point there. So as you can see, it kind of ebbs and flows over time, but historically that's where we've sat for debt. So this graph gives you a look at the projected outstanding debt and debt per capita information for the city from 2023 to 2052. So the only external debt, or sorry, the outstanding external debt at December 31st, 2022, as I said, was $41.3 million, and the debt per capita was about $399. The only external debt projected to be taken on outside of the current plan is for the Wellcock Secondary Access Project, and that's just over $8 million expected in 2032. So as you can see, based on the debt we have today, it will be paid off by 2052. So now if you took the last graph and you added the proposed debt debt-funded projects outlined in the next report, so the large capital report, the graph would look like this from 2023 to 2052. So the green on the chart represents the debt we currently have and are expecting the balances to be over the next several years. The yellow is the yellow portion of the graph is the proposed new debt outlined in the large capital report. So this is debt for the Nanaimo Operations Center, the Police Operations Building, the South End Community Center, the Waterfront Walkway, new fire station, and Beban updates. And the orange line represents the debt per capita. So the borrowing would peak in 2032 with an outstanding debt balance of $398.4 million, and that equates to a debt per capita of $3,286. And again, the debt per capita is calculated as the outstanding debt divided by population. So this graph gives you a look at the projected debt servicing costs associated with the debt from the previous chart. If we undertook the debt as outlined in the large capital report. So the green bars represent the debt servicing costs for the debt we currently expect and have. The yellow represents the debt servicing costs associated with the new debt as outlined in the large capital report.
And Councillor Manley has a question.
Thank you, Your Worship. Yeah, just with these two graphs, I'm noting that the timeline is till 2052, but some of the borrowing is going to be happening. So you've got a 30-year timeline here, and that's kind of what we borrow for in general, 20, 30 years. But some of this borrowing is not going to happen for another 5, 6 years, and so then wouldn't the graph kind of spread out past 2052?
Through Your Worship, to Councillor Manley, this graph represents the debt all of the debt being completely paid off. So it would all be paid off by 2052. Some of the debt, there's a combination of short and long-term debt in there. Mm-hmm. So the information that we have shows it paying off by 2052.
Yeah, so I'm just curious about whether, if we were borrowing for some of these large infrastructure projects in 5 years, why we wouldn't spread it out like 30 years to go, towards 2055 or 2058 or something like that.
So generally, historically, we've borrowed for 20 years.
Okay.
But that is a decision that could be made because we can borrow for up to 30 years. So that is a decision that could be made. Generally, we budget for 20, but that is a decision that council could make.
Okay, well, that answers my question, because I was thinking 30, but this is all budgeted for 20-year.
Yeah.
And Councillor Perino has a question.
Thank you, Your Worship, and through you to Ms. Mercer. When I look at this graph, which is quite fascinating, when you talk about the proposed debt servicing costs, so those are the items that we had talked about, but nothing, of course, is put to paper yet. This does not include any emergency items that might come along, garbage trucks, fire trucks, anything extra that might be needed as part of shall we say, ongoing maintenance of what the city does. Is that correct?
Yeah, through Your Worship to Councillor Perino, that is correct. This is only showing the debt that we currently have plus what's projected in the next report for large capital. It doesn't include anything for unexpected amounts that we might need to borrow for.
Thank you. And if I could just follow up with one question, Your Worship. So if we ran into a situation where we had an emergency, we'll say, or something that was needed, how would we deal with it? Because we're only $2 million away from what our limit would be.
Well, we would look at, there are different things we could do. We could push out other projects and use the reserve funds to pay for, the shortfall to fund the item that we need to fund. We do have some room left based on this, so we could use some borrowing. So there's a few different things that we could do.
Okay. Thank you so much, Your Worship. Thank you, Ms. Mercer.
So the orange line in the graph, a little different than the last one. It represents the debt servicing cost per capita. So that's the annual debt servicing cost divided by population. So under the community charter, as I've said, the city can have up to a maximum of $47.2 million in annual debt servicing costs, and that's represented by the blue line at the top of the graph. So we cannot have payments in excess of that amount. So the debt servicing peaks in 2033 at just over $38.5 million, with the debt servicing cost per capita of about $313. So based on these assumptions, we will still be under our limit per the community charter, but we are getting close to that line. But again, this amount will increase over time as each year this gets recalculated based on our revenues. But it does help you visualize where we would sit or the impact of if we took on additional debt. And it also gives you an idea of if you wanted a lower limit, how, where you would sit with on the chart if you chose a lower maximum limit. So I'll talk a bit about the some of the background for the draft debt policy. So the reason we drafted the debt management policy is that the city is committed to sustainable, prudent, and transparent financial management, and that includes the utilization of debt to provide valued community services. So the policy gives staff and council guidelines on how and when to use debt to fund investment. So it establishes responsible governance for the city's debt management. It establishes roles and responsibilities. It defines principles and objectives for debt management. And it also ensures that the city's debt management is compliant with statutory and legal requirements and is in accordance with Canadian public sector accounting standards. So when we were creating this debt management policy, the finance staff considered the same factors as we did when we created the reserves policy, and those are listed here. So affordability, transparency, accounting standards, all of these kind of principles and objectives are used when creating any of our finance policies. So key administrative processes outlined in the policy include the items listed here. So we utilize business cases where appropriate for a proposed investment that requires new external debt financing. So a business case will provide a robust analysis of the investment, be prepared in accordance with best practices, and includes relevant financial and non-financial information. So this gives staff and council all the necessary information to make an informed decision. And with regards to internal borrowing, staff ensure that the internal borrowing source is not impaired by the lending and that reasonable repayment terms are established. So we would never overborrow out of a reserve to pay for another project and limiting what we could fund with that money. And the city will develop and maintain annual reporting processes that provide decision makers with all relevant information. And I envision this as part of our year-end process is an update on all of our debt that we do with our financial statements. So some discussions around debt limits. So in the absence of policy language that talks to a debt limit, we default to the debt servicing limit outlined in the community charter. So staff would not recommend that we go to the maximum of our debt servicing limit, which would be $47.2 million, as it would limit future councils and, as well as Councillor Perino pointed out, our ability to react to unforeseen circumstances. So council may wish to consider a desired debt limit and direct staff to provide additional information on options and impacts. So some of the questions that you should ask when you are thinking about that is, do you want the city to be a pay-as-you-go municipality, so you're more debt averse, or are you okay with increasing the city's debt load? So that's your debt tolerant. So those are just, and where is your comfort zone in there? So kind of two items. So
If I may, Ms. Mercer, but just to be clear, I mean, any council can change that at any time.
that is correct, yes. So you can set this and then again in 4 years, revisit it. And if that's still the comfort zone, keep it, change it, however you would like, yeah. There's 2 items in the policy that we would like some feedback on. And so the first item, is council comfortable with keeping the community charter debt servicing limit as the upper limit, or would you prefer to choose a lower value? So for context, we looked at what some other municipalities have done when they have a debt management policy. Now, we didn't find a whole lot, but the ones we did find were there is a variety of different ways that they have calculated their upper limit. So several use the community charter limit. So if Nanaimo did that, we would keep our 47.2 maximum limit. One used 15% of sustainable and controllable revenues rather than the province's max at 25. And if the city did that, our debt servicing limit would be $28.3 million. One municipality used 7% of property tax revenues levied in the previous year for general debt, and 10% of sewer user fees billed in the prior year for sewer debt. And this particular municipality they don't take on debt for water, so they didn't have, there is no debt for water ever. So I don't know what their reasoning for that is, whether they don't have a water utility or as much responsibility, but their policy is absent on language around borrowing for water. So if Nanaimo chose to do this route, our general debt borrowing limit would be $8.9 million in annual debt repayment, and just over $821,000 for sewer debt repayment. And one municipality used a combination. So they used 15% of city revenues and 8% of property tax revenues. So if Nanaimo did that, our debt servicing limit would be $19.5 million. So as you can see, there's a wide variety of different approaches to take. The one thing, the one recommendation I would have for you is try to keep the calculation simple, because then it makes it easier for everybody to understand and it doesn't get convoluted. So you could do 50% or 75% of the community charter limit. That's an easy calculation. And if you did that, if you did 50%, you'd have 23.6 million, or if you did 75%, you would have a max of $34.4 million. Or you could be like the one municipality that changed the percentage. Instead of 25% of controllable and sustainable revenues, you choose a different amount. They chose 15, we could choose 15, 20, 10, whatever the comfort zone is. So give some thought to, are you comfortable with the highest limit, or would you like something different? The second item that we would like a little bit of input on is under Section 179 of the Community Charter. Electoral approval is not required when the total liability servicing cost is within the assent-free zone. So I won't go into the calculation on that, but just to say that there is a portion of debt that we can take without having electoral approval. So the policy has been written such that regardless of whether we are in an assent-free portion or not, the city will always seek electoral approval for long-term debt. So currently, we are anticipating some short-term debt being taken on without going for electoral approval. But this policy says we would never do that for long-term. So is that something that the committee and council is comfortable with, or are you okay with going for long-term borrowing without electoral approval? So so those are the the 2 items that we would like some feedback on eventually.
Councillor Thorpe has a question.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering about how Ms. Mercer would like to handle the process. I'm prepared to give feedback right now, or should we wait until later, Ms. Mercer?
Your Worship, Mr. Chair and Councillor Thorpe, there's a couple of things I'd like to say here. This is part of a suite of conversations that we'd like to present to you today. We're not asking for any decisions today. So that's first thing, but feedback and dialogue is important. So it'd be helpful to get through the 3 stages of this conversation. One is fiscal, one is scope, and business case for the certain projects that have been identified, and the third is legislative processes. So we're trying to lay the groundwork for informed decision-making throughout this. But and the other thing I will mention, and this will show up in the other slides, and Ms. Curry's got a very bold line in one of her graphs, shows that what's in this council's mandate in terms of what looks like projects that will happen now in decision-making that you'll be contemplating over the next 3 to 4 years versus longer-term things. So this is the full picture long-term. So when we're talking maximum debt of X in 2032, that's a couple of councils from now. So as the mayor indicated, there'll be a number of councils making decisions along the way on some of these projects, but you will certainly be setting the stage through a policy debt framework, and decision-making to advance any of these projects is certainly in your bailiwick. So I think conversation is what we would expect today, but probably you'll want to circle back after you've heard some of the other conversations and then continue with this. So this is just the first of probably a number of those types of conversations, and we'll go over that in the more detail as the presentations unfold this morning.
Thank you very much. In that case, I'll hold my thoughts on this until later, but I do have a more general question, if I may, Your Worship, through you. I'm just curious, Ms. Mercer, when we get our annual audit done, do the auditors examine, or would they examine our debt management policy and make any comment on that, or is that outside their remit?
You've beat me to the punch because that's my next slide.
Sorry.
No, that's... So our next steps are we will take what we've heard from the committee and council and make any necessary changes. So we don't anticipate this is our only discussion on the debt management policy, and we can come back to a future meeting and have further discussion on it. And once you have provided us with all of your feedback, we would go out to our external auditors and have them review the policy just to make sure that they are okay and we're in compliance with all of the accounting standards as well. So once we have done that and received feedback from council, the auditors, and staff, we would update the policy with all of that feedback and then present the final draft policy for council adoption. So that's the end of my presentation. Be happy to answer any questions that you still have.
Thank you very much. Councillor Gesselbrock.
Thanks, Chair. One question is, those debt projections, are they based on... I guess my question is, do we model sort of as population grows and there's increased taxation revenue, do we model what things will cost in terms of taxation incorporating that in? Or is that sort of separate to what the repayment costs would be for the debt servicing?
Through your worship to Councillor Gesselbrock. So we do project growth for population, and that is based on, I believe it is between 5 and 10. We take an average of growth over the last 5 or 10 years and then use that to project growth into the future. So that's how we've increased our population. So when we divide the total debt by population, that population is projected to increase with growth. So with regards to the cost of debt, we use, as I'll state in the next presentation, we use the debt interest rates that we have today. So we use those debt interest rates, even though we know they're going to change and they'll be different, but that is the best information we have currently. So does that answer your question?
So it is factored in there.
Yes.
For the per capita projections.
Yes.
Okay. My second question is, in terms of a debt policy, I guess, asking the question is, do we go out to, what council's comfortable in taking on in debt? Really, with our current policy, it doesn't matter because if we take on past, I think it was 5%, we have to go to a referendum anyhow, to the public. Is that correct?
Yes, if we're outside of that assent-free zone, you would have to go for electoral approval for that debt.
Okay. So I mean, I think that, that is the biggest policy is like, where do we set that limit of what we need to, go for public approval? And I guess the second thing is that, for me, are there a hierarchy of need in terms of public infrastructure? Does, fire and police come before, waterfront walkway, or do we see them all on a level playing field? Because I guess for me, like the fire, per capita of how many fire, the size of the fire department is fixed in terms of safety. Pretty similarly with police, and we need somewhere to put them. Whereas, so going out for public referendum on that, it seems to me like, is it really referendum on how nice the building is? Because I guess it's just things that we need. And so for me, it's kind of redundant to have to go to the public to ask to take that on. But for things like the waterfront walkway, where there's a bit more discretion, and there might be argument that it isn't. We need it for people's health, and that's just, the same level of need as safety. For me, that's, where a public referendum is really important for me, because sometimes I think for like the size of the fire department or the public works, it's kind of tricky to go to public referendum for borrowing that, because I don't think it's as apparent that we just have to do these type of things. So I haven't quite sorted my thoughts out on that, but they are big
Councillor
numbers. And I guess,
Gesselbrock, we're at the question stage, and once we get through the three presentations, we can have the more philosophical discussion. And Ms. Gurry,
Okay.
your hand is popping
Great.
up.
Yes, thank you, Your Worship. Through you to Council Gesselbrock. A lot of these questions and conversations will probably be answered in the approval of the electors presentation that I'll be doing. And yeah, I welcome that discussion, because those are all good points that I hope I'm going to be covering. Thank you.
Great. I get, so my final question then would be, is it normal for most municipalities to have to borrow to build required infrastructure, borrow the majority of the cost for core infrastructure like police and fire? Is that generally what has to happen? A municipality can't really afford these upgrades any other means.
Mr. Rudolph, please.
Through the chair to Councillor Gesselbrock, the typical pattern is yes, municipalities build these facilities. There are P3s, there are other models out there that have kind of come and gone. Some of the utilities that are out there, I was listening to the conversation about didn't show up on the books, the water. Well, very few, but there are some municipalities that have outsourced their water supply systems to EPCOR and these companies. White Rock was one example. I grew up in a town down in Easton, New Brunswick, that had completely privatized their water system. Ultimately, both of those came back into the municipality. So there are examples of that. There are different models to build municipal buildings. There's examples of leasing and so forth that are out there. So it's not just the model that we're used to. So the norm is what we're advocating. I would also say that we have to go back to what is the funding source for this. So we're talking about general taxation debt, as opposed to necessarily debt that's associated with, or projects that are associated with DCC projects, water projects, sewer projects, which have their own utility accounts. We'll give you an example. We have advanced on an emergency basis or a very priority basis this water project that's going on in the city, which was completely funded within the utility, and we've been building money for that. So that's upwards of a $50 million project, which meant other projects that had been planned to be undertaken over the next 5 to 10 years had to be moved out a little bit to accommodate that. So there are ways to accommodate things. So I don't know. I would say the way we're approaching this is typical to answer your question generally, and then the types of things that are in the suite of infrastructure is maybe the second tier of questions. Is a building essential compared to the pipes in the ground? That type of thing. There's certain parameters in terms of you need a pipe this big versus this big, or it's older and it's newer, that type of thing. So we're going to have some clarity around that. So what's the business case in this case for the two buildings that are being proposed? One for the operations center and for the police building, and thirdly a future fire hall, which is totally associated with growth and need, where the trend line is growing. So if we can go through all these things, I think maybe you'll form a greater understanding of what your questions are. And so this is really one foundational piece. Big piece is fiscal. Another is the operational aspects and the business cases for what we're talking about. And the third is process going forward. And so by the time we get through these three integrated reports, we hope to be able to, hopefully you'll have answered some of your questions, but probably generate a bunch more. And I would expect then we'd have to come back to you more than on one occasion to firm up what the plan is for all of these projects.
Great, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rudolph. In order, Councillor Hemmons, Councillor Perino, and Councillor Manley, please.
Thank you, Your Worship. Through you to staff. I just want to be clear on what I know we're not getting into the questions for discussion, but you've given us projected debt servicing costs and cost per capita if we do all of the projects on the table. And that puts us very close to our threshold. At the same time, you're asking us to contemplate whether we want to put a cap on that threshold. Is that accurate? So if we, in theory, choose a 50% cap, then we're looking at a 50% reduction in the projects that we can fund. Just want to be clear on that.
Yeah. Through Your Worship to Councillor Hemmons, that is correct. So it would limit how much debt you could take on. So it would inform decisions of what projects you would take on.
Right, and given that this is a policy, a new council could come in and completely make their own.
That is correct.
You can see where my thinking is going on this.
Yep.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Perino.
Thank you, and I apologize. I was saying Your Worship, but I neglect to say Chair, and I should have. So, Chair, question through you to Ms. Mercer.
Not a capital offense.
Oh, good, thank you. I'm just, my question is, do you go through this debt policy review for every council? How often is it done? I'm just wondering, there are several members of our council from the last council term, and I'm just wondering if we go through this every time.
Through the chair to Councillor Perino. We do not have a debt management policy. We did present it to the last council in 2019, just before the pandemic, and then it kind of was sidetracked with doing other things. So as we're bringing large capital projects with the borrowing as the funding source, it was a natural spot to bring back the policy. So that would be something, if council chose to approve this policy, we would have a review likely every 4 or 5 years. So yes, it would be brought back.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Manley.
Thank you, Chair. Through you, I'm curious, what is our assent-free zone currently? What's that cap? Do we know? Have it handy?
I will, through the chair, to Councillor Manley, I would have to get back to you on that because I don't have that number off the top of my head.
Okay, and then so the 25%, that's going to change. That 47 million, it's going to go up incrementally as the city grows. Do you have a formula as debt increases that would tell us what kind of tax increases people could expect as we increase debt?
In the next presentation, with the large capital projects, we have attempted to show what a potential tax increase is if you undertook all of that debt. So it's based on 2022 dollars. I don't know what the 1% of taxes is going to be in 10 years. So we base it in 2022 dollars, but we do try to anticipate what that impact would be.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Any further questions on this section? Not seeing any. Ms. Mercer, thank you very much. Much appreciated this morning and the work of your team to put this together. The next is 7B, Large Capital Projects Overview. Mr. Rudolph, please.
Thank you, Your Worship. Just to continue on the conversation, the next part of this presentation is really the meat of the discussion today. It outlines projects that have been in the public realm for some time in different levels, and some of the conversations council's had has actually been in private, given property, partnership, and other opportunities that might have occurred. So this is the first time I think we brought it all forward in a collective way. As I've indicated earlier, we have three kind of dimensions to this conversation. One is a fiscal, one is scope and timing of projects, and the third is legislative process. What is the process moving forward, period? So the four projects that are going to be spoken about specifically are the Operations Center, the RCMP Detachment Building Complex as it currently sits, the contemplation of a waterfront walkway, and a South End Community Center. We've already started a little bit of the conversation there. So the reason that we're bringing forward the operation buildings is really we've outgrown some of the space that we have. There's environmental issues attached to the NOC complex that are not meeting current standards to our satisfaction. There's gender issues with respect to facilities and having access for our female workforce. There's seismic issues. There's a lack of capacity in our current garage complex for the number of bays that we need and the size of the bays that we need, and the working conditions that are needed now as we move more into a green fleet scenario. That's sort of that'll be outlined by Mr. Rosen. The second is the RCMP complex. Again, we're about a third or more under what is recommended by the RCMP. We have a contractual obligation through our contract with RCMP to provide facility that meets their standards. I think that's negotiable, but we have that obligation. We're currently outsourcing some of the space into two other buildings for the current needs of the detachment, and its functionality is somewhat compromised by the way it's laid out. So there's an issue there, and we will go over that, the future. We have a short-term plan and then a longer-term plan. The waterfront walkway, lots of public engagement in the past, did not talk about cost. So I think that's a newer layer, and it's been mentioned, there will be some costs associated with that, explained in the calculation and that type of thing. And there are some obviously significant environmental and other considerations with that project. South End Community Center, that's a play that's underway. That's been on the books for 15 years. There's a committee out there in the South End looking at that. Partnership conversations have been happening with the library and maybe even VHA and those types of things. The sky's the limit in terms of building a facility in that part of the community. So the report speaks to all those. Mr. Rosen and I think other speakers can be here to explain the nature of that. There's some important charts in that report and in the PowerPoint that talk about the potential timing of those projects, and then we tie that back to fiscal and process. So we could talk a lot about a lot of these things, but I'll turn it over to Mr. Rosen, who's been the principal author of this report.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rudolph. Mr. Rosen, good morning, welcome, nice jacket.
Good morning, Chair and Council, and thank you for the note about the jacket. I don't get to wear it very often. So at an MO Operations Center, so this has been an ongoing conversation for at least 4 years now, in terms of discussions around how to deal with the longstanding and growing issues at Public Works and with Parks operations. So the current facilities, they're really unable to meet the needs of the organization. And over the course of the past 4 years, we've developed a vision for the Nanaimo Operations Center. It would include consolidation of some of the parks operations, in particular the satellite facility on Nanaimo Lakes Road, as well as some upgrades and reconfiguration of the parks operations yard on Perdot, consolidation of most of that on Labio, some new buildings, and some reorganization of the site. It's envisioned to occur over a number of phases. It's a large, complex project. In 2021, it was estimated to be in the neighborhood of $125 million. We haven't updated that number, but I would anticipate it's going to be more than that if we were to recost that out right now. It's a big project. It would be financially quite a large commitment. So to mitigate that and to sort of, eat the proverbial elephant one piece at a time, we've broken out a phase one that can stand alone, and that's envisioned to be essentially a fleet maintenance facility, as well as the necessary support infrastructure that would be consistent with development and site development and so on and so forth. So last year, Council directed staff to do some additional sort of scope refinement and risk evaluation for this phase one project. Staff have completed that now, and we're preparing to come back to Council in the spring here with an update on those results, as well as an update to the cost estimate for phase one. So I've got a few slides that show what the overall facility is envisioned to look like. So this is the administration building. Now, bear in mind, these buildings they're not public buildings. They're really just utilitarian. They do need to be durable and fairly rugged. They have to be some of them have to be post-disaster, like the administration building has to be post-disaster. So they're fairly strong buildings and durable, but they're not, they don't have a lot of aesthetic features or what I would consider sort of like discretionary elements. And then here's a picture of the fleet maintenance facility, which is really just a big shop with a few offices and a bunch of service bays in it, and parts storage and the essential elements to support that work. And I'll turn it over to Mr. Corson to talk about the RCMP. I'll come back a bit later to talk about a few of the other projects.
Thanks very much, Mr. Rosen. Mr. Corson, good morning, welcome.
Morning, Chair. So we've been working with the RCMP for the last couple of years on to address their space needs challenges. And the current building that the RCMP are in is around 42,000 square feet. And based on our work with the RCMP, based on the current staffing, it should probably be around 70,000. So it's a bit undersized at the moment. The current building was built in 1986 and then was expanded in early 2000s. By 2046, we expect the building needs to be in the 100,000 to 110,000 square foot range of size, just based on population growth and changing nature of the RCMP. So what we've been doing over the last little bit is, like Mr. Rudolph mentioned, we've broken the project into two phases. The first was how can we deal with the immediate space needs pressures in the building, and that's over a 5-year window from now to 2027. And to do that work, we're looking at expanding into the former fire admin building. And also doing some further renovations within the existing detachment. So that work is actually underway at the moment. We've just tendered the work for the renovations in a fire admin building, and that'll let some of the RCMP transition over to that building. And then we'll be able to make the renovations in 303 Perdot, and that should, at that point, buy us some time until we move on with the further expansion project. The long-term plan, we looked at a number of sites throughout the city to see if there was a different location suitable for the RCMP. And based on that analysis, came back with the current location is actually the preferred location. But it is a bit of a challenge to build on that site because you have to keep existing operations going while you build the new facility. And it creates a bit of a puzzle as you move the pieces around, keeping operations going and constructing the building. So the new building would likely start construction in 2026, 2027. It would take a year or two, or probably 2 years to complete. The overall cost we have up there right now is estimated in the range of 80 to 100 million. Council has given us funding to do quite extensive detailed design work. So that is the work we'll be undertaking over the next year or so. Right now, we're just finishing the business case for you, and we should be back in May or June with that. I'll present that to you so you get a further sense of the project and what it entails. We just have a few photos for you of what the building could look like. So this is the existing building. The existing detachment would remain during construction, and this building would be built between the detachment and Prideaux Street, and even a bit on Prideaux Street itself. So Prideaux Street would be closed to traffic, but open to public and cyclists. We'd keep the connectivity in that area. And then kind of in alignment with the new fire hall on the corner of Milton and Fitzwilliam, we would have a bit of a public square at the entrance there, which would mimic the fire hall. And then the new entrance to the police station would be off of Fitzwilliam there. And that's just another view of it. We're also working on fresh renderings, which will include all the new buildings in the area, including the fire hall and the supportive housing projects, so you can get a chance to see how this fits into the landscape. And then the waterfront walkway project, again, has been a very popular project and it's been talked about for many years. In 2017, we completed the waterfront walkway implementation plan, which looked at how we would could develop the walkway from Departure Bay all the way to the estuary and the Nanaimo River. And through that work, we identified sections which were more of a priority for the community, and the area between Departure Bay and downtown was seen as an area of priority focus. So in 2019, we did more work on the section between Departure Bay and the BC Ferries Terminal, and that recommended a Green Shores approach, which would allow for a separate cycling lane and a pedestrian area, a whole new beach project that would provide people access to the water, of course. And that was well received very much by the community. We did lots of background research, including sea level rise studies and coastal erosion, geotechnical work. We worked with all the permitting agencies to get a really good understanding of what Department of Fisheries Oceans requires, what the provincial government requires to lease the space to us, and did further consultation with the public on that. So it's certainly a project that we hear a lot of support for, and it really aligns with a lot of the work in the city plan that was done, whether it's the green Nanaimo, the connected Nanaimo, prosperous Nanaimo, and certainly an opportunity for some great First Nations partnerships, connecting the Departure Bay lands to the recently acquired property at Sealand Market. So, for this project, we have done costing on it before, and our engineering team have revised the cost estimate just based on where they believe the market is right now for these type of projects. So you can see the range there now would be between 30 and probably $40 million. I think that's all I have at the moment, Your Worship.
Thank you very much.
Oh, sorry, I have a picture. Yes, but you've seen these pictures before. Yes.
And the South End Community Wellness Center.
Thank you, Worship.
Morning.
Good morning.
Councillor Eastmer has a question, though. Sorry.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, thank you. I just, through you, Chair, the total construction cost, that's for the section that would be from Departure Bay to the downtown area to connect?
Yeah, so that's from the end of the BC Ferries Terminal to Departure Bay itself, the area between BC Ferries and downtown. A lot of the walkway has been completed. There's 3 pieces that are missing at the moment, and those are under jurisdiction of the Port Authority. And so we hope to work with them this year to do some further refinement on the costings of that. And that'd be a separate project. Right now, the current practice has been that they have their tenants build the walkway in those areas at the tenant's cost. and then the public has access to it. The challenge with that is it requires the tenants to actually be in a place where their lease is being renewed. So those are only certain periods of time. If we wanted to accelerate that, we would probably need to work with the Port Authority and bring some extra funding to the table for that. So that's not part of that estimate.
I gotcha. Okay, thank you.
Very good. Mr. Harding.
Thank you, Worship. As Mr. Rudolph indicated, South End Community Center Wellness Center has been something that community's talked about for many, many years. It was the last unfulfilled major project in the 2005 Parks, Recreation, and Culture Master Plan. And so as we went into the Reimagine City Plan, which is the updated Parks, Recreation, and Culture Master Plan, it wasn't surprising again that the need for more recreational, cultural community space was highly desired throughout the community, but especially in the South End that's underserved in that area. Last year, Council provided funds for us to proceed with taking it just from a concept or even a thought to more of a, let's do a feasibility study, start looking at the details, what this could provide. Council provided the funding. We created a steering committee. The steering committee's been working over on it for the last, well, since February last year. We'll come to the community with a final feasibility concept of what the community's been working on with some overall thoughts. Also doing a lot of stakeholder work with a number of organizations that could be partners within this facility if it proceeds, as well as utilizing all the materials that we got from support groups, cultural groups, other community groups of the need of what kind of space they would like to see in the community as we did that through the Reimagine process. So right now, we'll show a slide in a second here. Depending on our partnerships, who we have, this building could be anywhere from 40,000 square feet to 60 to even 65,000 square feet. It could definitely serve, wouldn't serve just the South End, it would serve the region, just like Oliver Woods and other facilities do. These facilities support a variety of organizations, groups, but it also would be central to the South End to provide services there. The operational or the overall capital costs could anywhere between 40 to 80 million, again, depending on our partners and the final size and what those partners could bring to the table for capital dollars or lease dollars or operational dollars. And so those things will be worked out. Time frame is to come back to council this year and the public with final feasibility and give some options on its type and its potential location. We've looked at about 8 different locations. We'll narrow that down for council and the community later on this year. Next slide is just a quick idea based on the work to date of, I know it looks like lots of big circles, but those circles, rather than showing it, floor plans and such, because we're premature on that, although we do have a couple of floor plans, this really kind of shows the general types of uses that we see. So a lot of it would be Oliver Woods, but then Oliver Woods bigger with a variety of other uses. As Mr. Rudolph mentioned, we think there's a real opportunity with Vancouver Island, groups like Vancouver Island Library, the VHA, daycare providers, other private providers. We're, of course, we have a memorandum of understanding working with the school board of potentially doing something together as well, and a variety of others. So again, any questions you may have now or later, please to answer.
Thank you very much, Mr. Harding. Any questions of Mr. Harding at this juncture before we turn it over to Mr. Rosen? Mr. Rosen, please.
Thank you, Chair. So that's a brief overview of the 4 primary projects that we've been talking about for a number of years now. But as we prepared this report for council, we wanted to envision or anticipate what other borrowing pressures or project requirements may be sort of on the horizon over the next sort of 10 years or so. So we wanted to put them out there just to make sure that council understood the sort of the financial context of everything. So, and then one of the other things that's going on right now is we're in the process of developing an update on the asset management model and situation for council. That'll be coming forward in the spring. And we anticipate that the funding pressures for facilities is going to be greater than what council previously had understood back in 2016 and 17, the last time we did an update. So there'll be some significant cost pressures there for sustainment of the existing facilities. I won't go through each one of these other capital intensive potential projects, but maybe I'll just point out a couple of them. Bevan Park, you know, it was constructed in the 70s. A lot of those major critical building systems, they're original. So the structural systems, the building envelope, the mechanical systems, many parts of the electrical, they need to be renewed. Certainly within the 10-year horizon, it's a package of projects that we're envisioning. We had included in this list as a major facility renovation. The scope is yet to be determined, timing is yet to be determined, but we just wanted to make sure that it was sort of put out there because it is something that we envision being necessary in the foreseeable future. Another one that's relevant is the water supply dam. We've been very fortunate with water conservation and so on that has sort of put off our need for a new water supply dam. Right now we're looking at maybe potentially 2061 might be the year where we need to build that, obviously subject to changes to climate and so on, could change the timing of that, and obviously population growth. But we're fortunate that that's something that has been pushed out. And then future emergency services. We talked a little bit about earlier about need for a new fire hall, so that's on the list as well as something that we need to consider. I'll move to the next slide to show a bit of an illustrative timeline. So to be able to apply the financial analysis, we had to put together a bit of an illustrative timeline.
Councillor Perino has a question.
Thank you, Chair. If we could just go back to the last slide, Mr. Rosen, if I could just ask a quick question through the chair. Can you just name for me some of your thoughts around what cultural venues in the downtown would look like?
I'm going to refer to Mr. Harding for that one.
Mr. Harding.
Thank you, Worship, Councillor Perino. Be continuing building on some of the venues we already have in the downtown, but there's also objectives to improving more. There's always a desire for more cultural performance space, for example. So could Councillor Perino may or may not remember, or the goal for the Port Theatre to have an extra small performance space. The art gallery is definitely wanting an upgrade and a new facility. But then there's also opportunities for other types of improved cultural venues in the downtown, as well as council working on this building where we are right now, even this room, the Shaw Auditorium, how it could be utilized better or more for cultural performances, cultural spaces, things like that.
Thank you so much, Mr. Harding. That's great. Thank you, Chair.
Mr. Rosen?
Back to the illustrative timeline. So we obviously can't...
Councillor Easterling has a question now.
Thank you, through the chair. My question is about the water supply dam. How much are we taking into consideration proposed projects that are sort of in the works right now? For example, like the Sandstone project, there was talk of like needing to twin the water reservoir to serve that development. Is that part of the consideration when you say that we're not concerned about the current capacity?
I'm going to refer to Mr. Sims on this. He's walked down and...
Thanks, Chair. To Councillor Eastmere's question, so the growth within the community, including developments like Sandstone, is allowed for. So we've projected for population growth. We've projected for, included in our DCC bylaw, those types of projects that will support growth. In fact, the dam itself supports growth and is part of the DCC bylaw as well. It's really about sort of our current studies, and we would like to get in front of council with an update to the water supply strategy that we have, illustrate considering growth, considering water conservation, as Mr. Rosen alluded to, and our current understanding of climate change, we're projecting that we don't need that dam until 2061. So that's a major, well over $100 million project. The interim stuff like smaller tanks and reservoirs to serve Sandstone are a lot smaller and can be sort of already incorporated into our DCC bylaw, if that makes sense.
It does, yeah. Appreciate knowing that. Thank you.
And Councillor Manley, please.
Thank you, Your Worship, through you to staff. So we did a tour of the Nanaimo Operations Center and the fleet management, and for the benefit of the public, you can't get a full fire truck into that maintenance building. It sticks out the front of it. But I'm curious, what vintage is that building? It's cinder block construction. It's not seismically up to code. How old is that facility?
Through the chair to Councillor Manley. So the actual buildings at Public Works were constructed over a whole series of years. The original buildings, and there's a couple of them, including the core of the fleet maintenance facility, was constructed in the mid-60s. And then the part of the administration building was the mid-60s, and then a couple of the other, we call it the casting shed and the truck barn, those were similar vintage. So those sort of like the original Public Works facility. It actually predates amalgamation. And then over the years, there was bits and pieces added on. There was like a storage warehouse added on, additions to the shop, additions to the administration building, and so on.
But seismic upgrading is a concern with these buildings as well. I noted in the presentation, it was saying that they're not intended to be pretty, but they are there for emergency preparedness and emergency response. So that's a key consideration in this upgrade.
Yes, it's key. Originally, when these buildings, the buildings that are there now, when they were constructed in the mid-60s, we didn't know as much as we know now about the earthquake potential for the region here. So a lot of them are made with unreinforced masonry, which performs very poorly in a seismic event. The new buildings would be, the administration building and the fleet maintenance facility would be classified as post-disaster buildings. So, after the earthquake, all the systems should be functional and be able to use the building for its intended purpose. There's a dedicated storage facility that can be at a lower level of design, so just not so it doesn't collapse, but it doesn't have to be quite as serviceable after a disaster. But certainly, seismic resilience has been considered throughout all the scopes of all the new buildings there.
Okay, and then also seismic for the RCMP and for Bevan Park, are those buildings up to code for seismic events?
So are you talking about the existing RCMP facility?
Yes. Yeah, the existing RCMP, and then we're talking about upgrades to Bevan Park in the long term, and I'm wondering about the seismic.
So the RCMP building, when it was constructed, again, it was constructed in, I believe it's the early 80s. It was not designed to the current size, the current building code, the seismic elements of the current building code. We have looked at the seismic capacity of the RCMP building, and it is far below current code. Okay. Far below current code. The new building would have to be post-disaster, so again, it would have to be operational immediately preceding an event. Bevan, mid-70s construction, doesn't have, it wouldn't have been designed with significant seismic resilience in mind. We haven't reviewed it specifically from a seismic resilience standpoint, but I anticipate if and when we do, there'll be some upgrades that are wanting.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Thorpe.
Thank you very much, Your Worship. If I may, through you, this would be directed towards Mr. Harding. Looking at the slide, other future needs to consider, I'm always impressed with our staff's long-term planning, which goes on behind the scenes. And I always appreciate that. But I'm curious, Mr. Harding, if I may, to you, in your long-term planning, have you identified, as our city is growing so quickly, future needs related to recreational indoor facilities? I'm thinking primarily of arena playing surfaces, ice hockey surfaces, and outside possibly ball fields. I think our field situation is pretty solid, but could you just comment on that?
Yeah, thank you, Worship, Councillor Thorpe. So City Plan Reimagine, again, identified a number of areas of need, and particularly the aspect of recreational cultural spaces throughout the city we're short on. That's why the South End Community Center is a real start on providing more of that built indoor space. So I think right now I'd say our greatest need is that built indoor space, recreational cultural space, where we know we can fill those spaces up with activities. And now, I've said it for a while, we had 3 Oliver Woods non-pandemic years, they would be full every night. So to answer your question, South End is the one right now to get that going. We see definitely for more built space in the north end. For ICE and others, ICE user groups would definitely like more sheets of ice. Those kind of decisions will have to come back to council because it's at demand of where do you want to put those funds in. We are doing well with sports fields in general. Particularly if we can get the two artificials in at Harewood this year, that's a real big shot in the arm for the outdoor sports groups. But we'll also need to start doing some improvements for the north end. We see us doing another needs for some more artificial turf in the north end in the next few years. If that does answer your question, but there's always more demand.
No, thank you, and I appreciate that you are looking ahead, and obviously future planning is very important, but I recognize that we have a diminishing amount of available land to put facilities such as ice surfaces or arenas or even ball fields. So I'm just curious about how we stand currently, and apparently we're able to handle the demand. I won't mention pools because our challenge is to staff what we already have.
Your Worship, the Council of Thorpe, on regards to land, it's probably more detail than you're looking for, but we've decided a number of years ago for sports field is not to build new sports fields, but to work with the school board and work with us redoing fields so that we're not clearing land for it. That's again why the artificial turf fields are such an efficient way of providing sports facilities for groups and organizations. So we can take an older field, make it into an artificial, and then just exponential use of those fields go with that. And same with now, I think with city plan, we know we're not going to be able to put every facility where in the parks lands we have right now, but we want to try to, when some of those town centers are developing and densifying, can we secure some sites for future recreational space, be it ice, be it more built recreational space, built cultural space. Again, with the South End Community Center coming back to you, it's strategically where we want to put that it's right in the town center or the center of where densification is going to happen.
Right, really appreciate that. Thanks, Mr. Harding.
Thank you. Councillor Himmons.
Thank you, Your Worship. Through you to staff, recognizing that this is to be determined, we've got the phase 1 of NOC starting next year, and I'm thinking about the cost overruns of all of our capital projects recently and wondering if that $40 million figure, I understand it's been marked in the report as, we're kind of moderately confident in it, but are we planning to have bigger contingencies or to have clear numbers before we get into that?
Through the chair to Councillor Hammond. So staff are working right now to update the cost projections for that NOC phase 1 in anticipation of coming to council this spring with an update report. It'll include an updated but recommended budget number. And certainly the cost estimate includes the forecasted escalation in the market to the timeline of the expenditure or the cash flow. In the past, it's really looking in a crystal ball. And we've consulted the industry experts on this, and frankly, it's impossible to get it right. So we certainly have contingencies that we bake into these budgets. And to be honest, we're quite conservative with projects of this nature that have like a public assent piece, because it's very difficult to increase the budget later on. So we have to, it seems like a lot for a project like that, but we have to have a fairly generous budget because it's so difficult to change it later. I hope that answered your question.
It does, and if I may, a follow-up, that wouldn't then presuppose that we build up to our budget, correct? So we're setting it at a certain amount because we don't want to go back and ask for more, but that doesn't mean we're going to build up to that amount.
So the important piece here is the borrowing limit for the project. And so the project, we're going to drive the costs down on the project as much as we possibly can. We're going to do value engineering. We're going to make sure that we're getting good value out of every cent we spend. But we have to have that borrowing limit just in case the project does have to reach that limit. So the AAP, or the alternative approval process that we're going to be looking at for this, it'll set that upper borrowing limit for the maximum.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. And Councillor Gesselbrock, a question, please.
Thanks, Worship. Just on recreation facilities, Council, question to Mr. Harding. Have we seen usage of indoor facilities return to post pandemic levels? Or to pre-pandemic levels?
Your Worship, to Council Gesselbeck, it's starting to get there, and now in some areas actually exceeding. So particularly for gymnasium space within the winter months, we're exceeding our demand now for that space. So that's coming back, and I think we'd see that in the pools and with the rinks also, that they're definitely coming back to those pre-pandemic numbers. We do have those staffing issues and some hour issues that aren't providing the hours that we had before. So as soon as we get to those capacities, I think you'll still see that capacity grow and increase, or the desire or demand grow and increase.
All right, thank you. Yeah, just some thought, like, you know, I no doubt that we're very under capacity for indoor space, you know, in the south end. You know, just with future planning, the level of intensity in terms of keeping heated for indoor spaces, you know, their pandemic resiliency, take into factor. You know, I have heard of some municipalities really pivoting in terms of planning for more and more indoor space, to looking at how to optimize and expand outdoor space because of just the less maintenance and complexity, along with, you know, pivotability for you know, panic type situations. And I know it's a balance, and we do have to deal with those winter months, but something, you know, for future, you know, planning and thought, and, you know, maybe not quite relevant to this current conversation, but just something that did come to mind. Thank you.
Mr. Harding.
Thank you, Worship. Just to add a little bit to Councillor Kesselbreck, again, going back to city plan, it did have a combination of both of what you're mentioning. So there really is a desire for us to go inside out, and that's why some of those outdoor performance spaces, there's a desire for upgrades, and so particularly the stadium district has been very provide those types of venues. People want to get back outside for those outdoor events. You see that with the desire for downtown Nanaimo, Maffeo Sutton Park, so those are there. But there is also that real desire for these built indoor facilities, and I would just remind even the community how central Bevan Park Social Center was throughout the pandemic. It would have been the emergency hospital. It was the place for all of our immunization shots. The South End Community Center, and it's also a reception area for emergencies. The South End Community Center would be also then a reception area for the South End community for any emergencies that happen. So these are true community centers that provide a variety of different uses.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Your Worship, if I could add another comment, it's building on the question from the previous councillors on recreational facilities. I would note that on the list there was the Bevan Park complex. It's not just the buildings. So Mr. Harding and I have been talking recently about making sure that council is aware of the Bevan Park plan and the overall site plan, and there's some opportunity to utilize that site more effectively, especially with the Midtown Gateway project opening up and with a traffic signal to that area. It is very central, and so there would be an opportunity to not only retrofit the existing complex at some point in time, but maybe reimagine it to some extent. And we see examples in other cities where they're taking it to another level. And there is a demand for other facilities. Dry indoor space is limited. The pickleballers have made overtures to council on that as an example, but there's other groups that would benefit from that. We did lose the Departure Bay facility, and that's been relocated to other locations, putting demand pressures there, which squeezes out times. The other thing I just mentioned, because I think it is something to be mindful of as we go through all these things, is the word partnerships. And not only just to have tenants in buildings, but maybe contributing partners to the complexes that we're contemplating. I think that's, I'll use an example. The university is looking for a gymnasium. maybe there's something there that would have some synergy with the city in terms of its aspirations. I also would note that the Mayor's Leaders Table is going to be taking a kick at a large suite of capital projects throughout the city, some of which are municipal, some of which are much different. But that's another layer into this conversation. And what would those folks say about some of these opportunities? So just wanted to mention those concepts as you're working your way through the sequence of contemplation over the next months and years.
Thank you, Mr. Rudolph. Mr. Rosen?
Thank you, Chair. So this is my last slide, but just a couple of points. So you can see we've demonstrated an illustrative timeline here. This is a very ambitious series of projects, and there's only a certain amount of capacity to be able to deliver a large number of very substantial projects like this. And it's not just staff capacity, it's just our corporate decision-making ability, the market's capacity to construct and design and do all that sort of work. So we've spread these out in a very deliberate way in accordance with perceived sort of urgency and how it fits in with the rest of the projects and the phases and so on. This also helps council in terms of decision-making, because you don't have to make all the decisions all at once. You essentially sort of one project at a time, one phase at a time. You know, as to Councillor Perino's earlier comment about our debt ceiling limit and leaving some room in there, you know, as we go with these projects, you know, if something comes up, we can always change course. You know, we're not making all these decisions right now. We'll make them one at a time as things progress. So I'm going to turn things over to Ms. Mercer to look after the financial piece.
Thank you, Ms. Mercer. I'm looking at Ms. Gray, looking at the time. Ms. Mercer, how much longer to finish this section?
10 minutes?
Then let's finish this section and then we'll take the morning break. Thank you, please.
Thank you. So we've talked about the details of the projects, and the next few slides will talk about how we're going to fund them. So the assumption made is that the majority of the projects budgeted will be funded through long-term debt, as we don't have sufficient internal reserves to pay for all of them. So some components of a project cannot be funded through debt, and we would use our internal sources for those. So an example is public art can't be funded through debt. So little things like that we would fund through our internal reserves. So borrowing is an excellent option to fund large projects such as these, as it provides intergenerational equity. However, repayment of this debt will impact the city's financial flexibility for decades. So the trick is balancing the intergenerational equity while leaving room for future councils to borrow for capital projects. So the chart, sorry, I turned myself off. The chart here lists the projects, their estimated costs, and the level of confidence that staff have in each of those estimates. And of course, before any electoral approval is sought, more work will be needed to be done to refine these costs. So when we go out for borrowing, we have a fairly solid idea of what the costs will be. So this slide attempts to illustrate the potential timing of each project, as well as the associated potential property tax impact of borrowing if all the borrowing was undertaken as planned in Mr. Rosen's timeline. So each of the projects are listed with their estimated costs. So these are rough estimates to give you an idea of what the cost impact will be for each year, as there are many assumptions that have gone into calculating these numbers. So we've assumed that the borrowing period is 20 years for long-term debt and 5 years for short-term debt. And that's how we have historically borrowed for terms. We have assumed that the long-term debt interest rate is 4.66%. as that was the MFA's indicative lending rate when we created this chart. Now, and this is the rate that the ministry requires us to use when we're projecting costs. And of course, as you know, interest rates have been quite volatile as of late. So by the time we go to borrow, this interest rate will be different. Could be higher, could be lower. That will be determined at the time we actually go to borrow.
And just to be clear, looking at this chart, when we peak out, based on the numbers that are available to us, at $31,920,500 in 2032, and the tax increases below, that is just in reference to the costs of the borrowing, if you will, annual cost total.
Yep.
I mean, if we decide on another major project, it will be higher, and obviously if we didn't proceed with any of these projects, it would be different as well. But just to be clear, that strictly relates, this projection relates to these major projects.
Yes. So any of the estimated property tax increase is just related to this, taking on this debt. It doesn't include any staff increases or cost escalations for RCMP or utilities. It's just, this is just the estimate based in 2022 dollars for the debt.
Thank you.
And of course, as I've mentioned, the amount of borrowing could change for these projects as their more refined estimates come in. So as you can see at the very bottom of the chart, the projected impact each year of if we took on the borrowing as outlined in the timeline. So
Councillor Perino has a question too.
Oh, thank you, Chair, and through you to Ms. Mercer. I'm just looking at the very first one, the NOC Phase 1. So would you go out to get either alternate approval process or a referendum? Would you go out to get the cost of the entire project? I just see that it's over 4 years. So you might not need the money, say, in 2024, but you might need to, like, do you go back in for further referendums or further alternate approval processes, or do you just do it as one?
Through the chair to Councillor Perino. So we would get approval to borrow for the entire amount, so the 40 million, if that's what we determined the project to be. We would get approval to borrow up to $40 million, and then each year we would look at the cash flow we need and borrow that amount. So we would be approved up to 40 million, but we would only take what we need. We wouldn't need to go back for a referendum or alternative approval process unless we needed more than that 40 million.
Thank you. And Chair, if I could just ask one more question. When you do the, when you talk about the estimated property tax increase, would you not label these separately from the actual tax increase so that the public knows, you know, this amount is for the NOC or this amount is for the South End Community Center, so to speak, so that they can see how it's separated out? Is that not how it's done?
Through the chair to Councillor Perino, yes. So currently on the tax notice, we break it out between general tax portion and debt. So it could certainly be, we could either lump it in with the debt that we already have in the line of the property tax notice, or we could have a separate line that said, this is the debt associated with the Nanaimo Operations Center. Yeah.
Gotcha. Thank you so much. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, so like I say, this has an estimated property tax increase per year based on a 2022 1% of taxes. So this chart illustrates the outstanding balances over the next 20 years. So this is kind of a more colorful chart than the one I had in the last presentation, as this is broken down as on the chart. If you can read the little legend on the side, it's broken down by each different borrowing project. And this is if we undertook all the borrowing as outlined in the illustrated timeline. So the peak of the borrowing is in 2032 with an estimated outstanding balance of $398.4 million. So for reference, the outstanding debt at the end of 2022 was $41.3 million, and the debt servicing cost was $5.7 million. And again, this is very pretty much the same chart as from the last presentation, and it illustrates the annual projected debt costs associated with the borrowings over the next 20 years if all of the borrowing was undertaken. And as I mentioned in the previous presentation, the city's annual servicing limit is 47.2, and that's represented by the line at the very top of the chart. And of course, this value will change each year, but that's what ours is today. So the projected debt payments peak in 2033 at 35.8 million. And in this scenario, the city would be at approximately 76% of the current debt limit. Of course, that will change, but based on the number we have today, that's what the percentage would be. So as you can see, when you're discussing a debt policy, that has an impact on what you can borrow for. And again, you saw this in the last presentation, but this table shows how Nanaimo compares to other municipalities with regards to the utilization of our debt servicing limit. And this is at 2021 because that's the last comparative information we have. And Nanaimo sits in the middle of the group with this. And kind of same comment for this. We had this one in our last presentation. And again, Nanaimo's debt per capita in 2021 was $451. The highest being Ladysmith at $1,854, and the lowest of Saanich at $384.
So you don't happen to know what accounts for Ladysmith's significant per capita debt, do you? Anyone here tell me? Just out of curiosity. Mr. Sims. Just one of those quirky questions.
Your Worship, I believe it would be for a couple of massive infrastructure upgrades relative to the size of the town. It includes a sewage treatment plant and a water treatment plant at the same sort of within the same era.
Okay, thank you.
And that's the end of the financial section for it. And I'll pass it back to Mr. Rosen, or whoever's doing the last bit.
Thank you, Ms. Mercer. Mr. Rosen?
Yeah, Your Worship, I think the more illustrative graph to look at is the long-term 20-year one, not the most recent, because it really doesn't give you a contextual picture. Over the course of time, all municipalities go through higher levels of debt borrowing than it's like waves in the ocean. And you know, when this facility was constructed, or other things, you saw the graph earlier, there was a peak. So regardless, ultimately, if any of these projects go forward, we're going to see another escalation in that curve. So it's a long-term picture that I think you should really be mindful of, because these are, you know, 50, 75, 100-year investments. And I think you need to look at it as a long-term investment. Like the water project, as big as it is, it's a 100-year investment for resiliency. So I think if you amortize the costs over the long run, you'll feel somewhat more comfortable in terms of that. But I think that's an important thing. And just to remind you, after the break, I think our closing act will be Ms. Gurry, who will actually try to tie this together procedurally and at a legislative level, but then we need to come back procedurally, and you've heard examples of what I always agree that the next steps are what's having a clarity around what's coming next. So I think she will talk specifically about decision-making on the legislative side, and that will be the key. And then some of these other updates will be coming along as these projects unfold over the course of this year.
Who's going to take us to the next steps?
I tried to just cover that, but can maybe suggest we come back to that after Ms. Gurry's presentation?
I saw Mr. Rosen and Ms. Mercer looking at each other, so I thought they had something more to say. No? All right. Not seeing any questions right now. Let's take the morning break, Ms. Gurry. 10 minutes. Thank you very much, and thank you to everybody for their presentations this morning. thank you, everyone. Back at it, please. And the next item on the agenda is the approval of electors, or the electors. Ms. Gurry, good morning, please.
Good morning again, Your Worship. Thank you, and it's nice to be here this morning. This presentation will be, as you noted, on the approval of the electors, the different methods of how you can obtain approval of the electors, and some recommended best practices for either the alternative approval process, which is one of the methods, and or a referendum, otherwise known as assent of the electors. And first, I would just like to introduce Ms. Jessica Vanderhoof. She is the new Steno Coordinator in Legislative Services, a position that was previously filled by Ms. Snellgrove. So she is here assisting me today and was a co-author of the report. She's recently taken a local government course, and her project was actually on approval of the electors, so she is participating with me here today. So welcome, Jessica, and thank you.
Very good.
So an overview. When considering whether to proceed with a referendum, assent vote, or an alternative approval process, AAP, the history, scale, cost, public expectation, and timing of the proposal needs to be evaluated. Approval of the electors is required for issues related to municipal loan authorization bylaws and decisions that have potential long-term future impacts on citizens. Earlier, there was reference by Ms. Mercer to an assent-free zone. An example of that, where approval of the electors wouldn't be required, is our water treatment plant, for example. However, we did go to an AAP, an alternative approval process for the water treatment plant. And the reason that would be considered an assent-free zone is because it was prescribed or required by regulation. So it was under regulation, there was updates, a water treatment plant was necessary and prescribed. Therefore, approval of the electors would not necessarily be required. We did do an alternative approval process anyhow, regardless. Approval of the electors is required for issues related to, I already said that part, so where approval is required, it may be done by referendum, as I noted, or by AAP. So those are the two processes for long-term borrowing, as Ms. Mercer already prescribed or described. So for an alternative approval process, an AAP, it's considered the best approach when local governments are dealing with a project that must be completed in order to continue to provide municipal services. So in saying this, if there's major infrastructure requirements to our public works building, and it's required for the new Nanaimo Operations Center to have new buildings in order to continue to provide those services, an AAP is often considered a best approach because it's required in order for us to continue providing the services that we already do provide and to continue to provide those. It can offer some increased convenience over a referendum as it provides electors with at least 30 days to express their opinion. So for approval, the alternative approval process, it is otherwise known as a petition, a counter petition, thank you, Jessica, whereas you only submit your vote if you are opposed, and you have 30 plus days to submit that counter petition to the City of Nanaimo. And holding an AAP, it shouldn't say usually, it is always less expensive than holding a referendum, and we'll go into that a little bit more, and it was outlined in your report as well. A referendum, which is coming up here, it is the same process actually as having an election. So you need your voting locations, you need to hire your staff, you need to order your ballots, you need to have your voting machines, you need to have all of the supplies, etc. The list is endless of the costs and logistics required during a referendum. So the costs are exponentially more. And it requires council to establish a yes or no question to ask electors on the ballot. So for example, we had a referendum in 2017 in the City of Nanaimo, and it is usually related, or it is related to the borrowing bylaw that is required, and it is, do you agree to borrow up to, and at that point it was $80 million, to build and have an event center in the city of Nanaimo. That was the referendum in 2017. So it's a yes or no question on the ballot. It can be held at the same time as an election, which is cost savings in that you're already having an election, so it can be a question on the ballot along with the list of candidates. And it can list more than one question on the ballot as well. I think it's up to 2, and or you can combine projects together. So I think I have an example later on where you can ask the question, do you agree to borrow up to such and such amount for a South End community center and a waterfront walkway? So it's like projects listed together, and you can just hold one referendum. But you can also separate those questions as well. And I think you can have up to 2 questions on a ballot, and any more questions you would have to have subsequent ballots. So before implementing a new major capital project that has been discussed today, there are normally public expectations regarding elector approval and input. A referendum is often the process expected by electors for community amenity projects. So unlike what I was just discussing about an alternative approval process, an AAP, where it's a service, a municipal service, these community amenity projects, such as the South End Community Center or waterfront walkways, are not, well, they are nice to haves, so they're not necessary to continue to provide services. So a referendum is usually the way to go and best practice for those types of capital projects. So I'm just going to turn this over to Ms. Vanderhoof right now to go over an example AAP timeline. She's left out a lot of the detail at the end, but this just gives you an example should the committee, eventually council, wish to proceed with an alternative approval process for, I think the example Ms. Vanderhoof is going to use is the Nanaimo Operations Center.
Thank you. Good morning, Your Worship and Council, and thank you for your time. So my goal with this next slide is just to give a really high-level overview of the steps involved in the AAP process. Oh, thank you. And as Ms. Gray mentioned, it is intended as an example of the Nanaimo Operations Center. I've included a couple of dates just to give it a little bit of context of where meetings would sort of fall in just based on your current key date calendar. So that's why there's some dates included in there. And of course, this is for the AAP process, and as she mentioned, the referendum would be held the same as an election, so these timelines and dates wouldn't apply the same way. However, the requirement for municipal approval and the quashing period and processing the funds or seeking the funds through the regional district, all of that would still apply. All right. So the first step in the process is that a borrowing bylaw would be presented to council. There we go. And then the bylaw needs to receive 3 readings. Once the bylaw receives 3 readings, at 3 readings, it is sent to the Inspector of Municipalities for their review and approval. And usually that takes approximately 6 to 8 weeks for that process. After which, let's go to the next one. After which the notice of an AAP is published in accordance with legislation. And then after the notice period, the AAP can commence, and it must be held for at least 30 days. Following the 30-day AAP process, if less than 10% of the electors respond, it's considered elector approval through the AAP, and so at that point, the bylaw can then be adopted. Following that, there is a mandatory 1-month quashing period, and that's just to allow the electors to challenge the validity of this process. And then following that, the adopted bylaw is sent to the Inspector of Municipalities for a certificate of approval. That again takes approximately 2 to 4 weeks. From that point, once we receive our certificate of approval, then council can issue a municipal security issuing resolution, which is basically just a motion of council requesting that the regional district seek the funds on our behalf. So that is sent to them. And then these would be some of the steps the regional district would then complete for us.
Just one more thing to add, Your Worship and Council, as Ms. Mercer was pointing out as well, there's different intakes for borrowing. So if the bylaw for the Nanaimo Operations Center was to borrow up to $40 million, and after all of these steps were done, there's intakes for when you request the borrowing amounts and the funds necessary. So even though the approval would be for up to $40 million, there would be different amounts that we would do for the intakes and the interest applied for those amounts up until the project was done and up to $40 million, not necessarily the full $40 million.
Thank you.
Councillor Manley.
Thank you, Your Worship. So if the AAP, the threshold is 10% of negative response, if that fails, what's the next step?
If we were to receive over 10% of responses, then the next step would be you could either, and it's on, I think it's on this slide right now, council could choose to go immediately to a referendum. Okay. So it wouldn't be the end of the process. However, the difference with when you do a referendum, should the referendum fail, you're done. And you have to at least wait, you're not necessarily done forever, but you have to wait at least 6 months to come back with a different bylaw for a different process or a different amount.
Thanks. I should have just waited for the next slide.
You're ahead of me.
All will be answered in the fullness of time.
So this next slide is just trying to compare the AAP and the referendum process. And as Ms. Gurry noted earlier, the AAP approach is often best suited for continuing to provide municipal services, whereas a referendum is often used before implementing new major capital projects. The method of submitting responses and the timeframes for doing so differ between the two options, with the AAP providing a little bit more flexibility with the 30 days to provide a response. And another difference is the conclusion with the two. So with an AAP, there's the option to continue to the referendum within 80 days if the initiative is defeated at the AAP. But in a referendum, there is no option to go any further if the initiative is rejected. So the issue would be considered quashed if the majority is not in favor in a referendum. As we've noted in the report, there is a large difference in the cost between the two options, with an AAP being much more economical. And the large cost related to a referendum, as Ms. Gurry noted just a moment ago, is largely due to the expense of holding an event like an election and all that that entails. So earlier, Ms. Mercer had noted the 25% liability servicing limit, and that municipalities are subject to that. And that we cannot exceed 25% of our controllable annual revenues. So as of December 31st, 2021, the city's liability servicing limit was at $47.2 million per year. And we were utilizing 13.4% of that, which equates to just over $6.3 million. And that is indicated in the blue sections on the bottom of those columns in front of you. The red section in the column on the right represents the impact that the Nanaimo Operations Center could potentially have on our liability servicing limit, assuming the $40 million estimate that we've projected for phase 1 at this stage. And again, these numbers are all just estimates based on the Municipal Finance Association, and that's on their 20-year loan rate, which when I checked March 13th was at 4.66%. And these would obviously change with interest rate fluctuations. So on that, I will pass it back to Ms. Gurry.
Thank you. Great job. So for public expectations for seeking approval of the electors before implementing any new major capital projects considered to be community amenities, electors expect to be consulted in a clear, transparent manner, and often the referendum is considered for these projects. Electors need to have enough time and information to be able to make an informed decision with opportunities to provide their feedback, regardless of the method chosen for obtaining approval of the electors. So regardless if council proceeds with either an alternative approval process or a referendum, public input, open houses, feedback, targeted open houses and or meetings with relevant stakeholders, and a communication strategy would be required for either process. And considerations should be made when making a decision regarding holidays and time of year when scheduling an AAP or a referendum to ensure electors are available and able to participate. So having it during the summer is not ideal. It's not seen to be transparent to hold something like that over the summer holidays and or over Christmas holidays. And so timing is really important when considering either process, and often that is why, for example, municipal elections are held in October for snowbirds heading north, and yeah, so there's never quite a perfect time, but you should definitely consider time when making these decisions. And so in conclusion, and as Mr. Rudolph outlined earlier and has been trying to get us to convey to you today, so hopefully we have, is you have this entirely large process where you have a debt philosophy and or a debt policy that you could think of having where you're comfortable borrowing. You have these capital projects to consider, and then you have the method in which to proceed, should you wish to, with these capital projects, which would include long-term borrowing, which then does mean approval of the electors, and then you have your choice of how to obtain approval of the electors. The red line outlined in this graph, that is the same graph that was in the previous report and presentation. I put the red line in there to kind of show the decisions that you would have to look at possibly during this term. So there's this year's budget, there's this term's decision, and then there's future council decisions that are outlined below. Some of these could change, as Mr. Rosen was saying, based on need. For example, a future fire station, the need may need to move upwards, or like the dam that Mr. Sims was talking about earlier, it's now projected out to 2061. So needs can change, but looking at your term up to 2026, possible decisions that are on your horizon, the first being the Nanaimo Operations Center, could happen, as well as Waterfront Walkway, South End Wellness Center, and possibly a decision could be ready for you for an RCMP station expansion and new building during this term as well, though it's kind of looking like it might be the next term. Those are future decisions that we will be coming back to you to make. I think the next steps Mr. Rosen will cover a little bit, but a decision will be coming forward to you soon about what process, if you would like to go ahead and borrow money for an Nanaimo Operations Center, and if you would, what process would you like to do for that, undertake for that? So that's it, Your Worship.
Thank you very much. In order with questions, Councillor Eastmere and then Councillor Thorpe, please. And then Councillor Perino, I see.
Thank you. Through the chair to staff, what's the best practice around notifying the public of an AAP? I know in the timeline it says it would be published once each week for 2 weeks, so it's really just a 2-week warning period?
Your Worship, through you to Councillor Eastmere, that's the legislative requirement notification. That is not at all the only notification. So not unlike an election, you're required to do notices in the paper, and now we do have a new bylaw where we do notices on our website as well as the newspaper. That is by far not exclusive only of those things. We would do open houses, we would do information sessions, we would do stakeholder engagement. So we would have a communication strategy around, an engagement strategy around the project regardless of the process.
And that's sort of already built into our budgeting around how much an AAP would cost?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, my only concern with the AAP is that people don't get enough notice, and we saw with the, results of the election, like we had 24% voter turnout, so, and people were still saying they didn't know there was an election happening, and there was like literally election signs everywhere. So, yeah, it's just it would be important to make sure that it doesn't seem like we tried to slip something through with an AAP and really did engage as many people as possible.
Exactly, yes. Through the election in this past fall, there was more communication and engagement done than ever. At some point, I don't know when you can do more, but we can always improve for sure. But there will be extensive communication and engagement done regardless of the process.
Thank you.
Horses to water, but can't make them drink. Councillor Thorpe and then Councillor Perino.
Thank you very much, Your Worship. Microphone? Thank you. Thank you, Your Worship. Through you, if I may, first of all, to Ms. Gurry, a couple of questions, and my apologies if I missed this, but on the slide that's currently showing, point number 2, I know that a referendum can have combined questions, and I think the conference center referendum indeed was an example of that, if I recall. But I want to go back to the first point. Can you combine questions for an AAP as well? I'm not sure if you said that or I misheard.
Thank you, Your Worship. Through you to Councillor Thorpe, no. No.
So each one has to be separate.
Yeah, so one of the benefits of a referendum would be that you can combine questions, whereas an alternative approval process you cannot.
All right, and a second question, if I may, Your Worship. Assuming that either course was successful and we got voter approval, is there a time limit between getting that approval and actually getting the money? Or can we get the approval, put it in our back pocket, and wait indefinitely?
Through Your Worship to Councillor Thorpe. So once approval of the elector was obtained, either by referendum or AAP, we then have to get the servicing certificate from the Inspector of Municipalities and go through the process with actually obtaining the money from the RDN. The RDN actually, interestingly enough, because the Municipal Finance Authority does, through the RDN, issue us our money, the RDN can say no.
Right, but thank you, and I think I understand that, but my question was, in theory, could we get borrowing approval from the electorate and then simply do nothing with that approval until some unforeseen future date? And I see Ms. Mercer wanting to answer.
Through the chair to Councillor Thorpe. From approval, you have 5 years to use that money. So if you bundled questions, you have to make sure that you are able to do those projects in a 5-year timeline.
Thank you, that answers my question. And if I may, Your Worship, to Ms. Mercer, regarding the Municipal Finance Authority and their rates, is there much fluctuation in their rates from year to year? Or do they remain fairly constant, or are they just as unpredictable as bank rates?
Right now, they are fluctuating. I would say historically they've been pretty consistent, but in the last few years it has been volatile.
All right. Thanks very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Perino, please.
Thank you, Chair, and through you to Ms. Gurry. I just want to reiterate that we can do a referendum and it doesn't have to be during an election. And that was important to me because it was said a couple of times, and it's not necessary to do it as part of an election. You can do it separately. So I just wanted to make that statement. But the other surprise was when it was said, and I apologize, I'm not sure who said it, that we can only do one referendum and then it's done. And that's not, my understanding is that is not true. And so that's my question to you, because in my case, we had 3 referendums. Well, we had 1 AAP and 2 referendums for a new RCMP detachment years ago until it finally passed. So I just wanted clarification on that.
I think, Councillor Perino, what Ms. Gurry was speaking about is an alternate approval process. You can only ask one question per process. You may do them quickly one after the other, but that's the alternate approval process. With respect to the referendum, in which people would be voting, you can ask as many questions as you want. Is that correct, Ms. Gurry?
Yes, thank you, Your Worship. First, to your question, yes, that's accurate. To Councillor Perino's question, so the referendum can be held by itself. In fact, we did have a referendum by itself here in 2017. We had one by itself here in 2004. So we have had several referendums that stand alone outside of an election. My reference to the election was that you can combine a referendum with an election, which is one of the benefits of a referendum, because you can hold it at the same time as an election, and that would result in cost savings. The other reference to an election with the referendum that you might have misunderstood is that the cost of a referendum is the same cost as an election. So that is one of the differences between the two. For an AAP, yeah, and then as for not being able to proceed, for borrowing, long-term borrowing, and either getting approval of the electors either through AAP or referendum, it requires a borrowing bylaw. So if an AAP fails and you get over 10% of the electorate respond, you can immediately proceed to a referendum within 80 days. So you're not done at that point. You have an option to proceed to a referendum should the AAP fail. If a referendum fails, you are done for at least 6 months because it's the bylaw that has failed. So the bylaw has failed and you can't come back for at least 6 months, and you have to adjust your bylaw or adjust the amount you're borrowing for or adjust your project. So in your previous example, perhaps you adjusted the dollar amounts or adjusted the scope of the project, or you waited 6 months, because once a referendum fails, you are done for at least that 6-month period.
Great. Thank you for that clarification. And you're absolutely right. The price had gone up considerably, so we had to redo it. So I appreciate that. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Perino. Councillor Manley. Very good. What is the rough cost of an election now, Ms. Gurry? I've forgotten. I know what it cost me.
$285,000 is what it cost last in 2022. Yes.
Real money. Thank you.
Real money.
Any further questions on this particular section? Ms. Gurry, you're trying to get that mic to work?
I'm trying to get my microphone back on. So just through you, Your Worship, I'm not sure if we want that previous slide deck put back up for next steps, perhaps? Yeah, if we could do that. And I'm not sure if Ms. Mercer or Mr. Rosen wants to cover this off.
Mr. Rosen, please.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Rudolph earlier had outlined most of these next steps, but I'll just sort of reinforce a couple of them. With Nanaimo Operations Center, we're anticipating coming forward to Council with an update on the project, an update on the risk and the multi-use trail and the stormwater and those things that we've been working on for the past while. At that meeting, we're expecting to put forward a decision for Council to direct staff to come back with a bylaw for an AAP. And so the next report we're expecting to happen in either April or May. And then if Council directs us so, we would come back in probably June with, as Ms. Gurry outlined, with the AEP bylaw readings. We do have a fairly extensive communication strategy that we've developed for that project, and we'd be looking to implement that as soon as Council gives us the go-ahead. And that involves, a series of open houses, a lot of engagement sessions with stakeholder groups, and so on and so forth. I won't go into the details on the other projects up there, but we're continuing to work on them, and we'll be coming back to Council at appropriate stages of their maturity as things progress. So that's it for me.
Thank you very much. I think now is the time for Council, if they wish to express some views around the projects that have been talked about this morning, large capital projects period, or the draft debt management policy. Now would be the time for people to express their views if they're so inclined. For what it's worth, I mean, we have survived, if no one's going to jump in, of Councillor Thorpe. Good man.
Oh, well, Thank you, Your Worship. First of all, I appreciate the presentation this morning. It's been very valuable, and I personally am in favor of the path forward that I think I'm seeing staff suggest regarding a referendum for what I'll term as nice-to-have projects and alternate approval process for things involving services to the city. And as far as our debt level, going back to our earlier conversation and report, I think thanks to our good staff, our city is in a very healthy position, and a very responsible course has been taken to this point. I think there is room to take on more debt, and I am happy with the ceiling that we have now, which I believe is 25%. I don't know that we need to go beyond that, but I'm certainly willing to increase our debt responsibility in keeping with bringing some of these projects online. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Councillor Eastmere.
Thank you. I would just wonder whether a referendum for the South End Community Centre, whether we could consider an AAP for that one, recognizing the importance of that community centre from a community wellness perspective, and you know, the importance of the social determinants of health that I think that would support. And I just fear that perhaps the importance of that project would not necessarily be seen by the wider electorate, recognizing how valuable a project that would be, as opposed to something like the waterfront walkway, which is really a nice to have. I think the community center, in terms of all the supporting pieces that are potentially being considered there with community partners, I think that's a really important project, and I wouldn't want to see that fail simply because it's not in someone's direct neighborhood.
Thank you very much. I'm with you and Councillor Ms. Gurry. Sorry.
Oh, no, sorry, Your Worship. You could go ahead first, but I was just going to say in response to that, that whatever process you decided to go forward with would be a council decision. So it's not set in stone that would be what you would have to do. But the also benefit of a referendum, like we talked about earlier, is a combination question. And a lot of the benefits behind combining a question such as the South End Community Centre with the waterfront walkway is that it's one question for both community amenities. So you would have the whole community voting on that one type question.
Thank you. I'm going to jump in now. I usually wait to the end, but I just want to respond to Councillor Thorpe's and Councillor Eastmer's remarks. I'm with them, and I think that is the correct and proper approach. You know, arguably the folks in even central Nanaimo or north Nanaimo are not going to get a great benefit necessarily out of the South End Community Centre. And that strikes me as the kind of project where it should be an AAP. And by that I simply mean there would only be those who are terribly upset to stop it from happening when it is in the public interest to proceed with it. The same, in my view, applies to the knock. The waterfront walkway puts me in mind of a sitcom in the 60s, as I recall, that Judy Carn played the newlywed spouse of a fellow who was quite conservative and stiff, and he objected to her bringing home flowers, as I recall. And she remarked something to the effect it was good for the soul. I would argue that the waterfront walkway is important for the soul of the city in the sense that it speaks to our confidence, and it speaks to recreation and the importance of the waterfront to all of us. So that's the kind of thing I think that I would probably, and I'm not decided on this, lean towards in terms of an actual public referendum, because it is central to the city and important. And as to use Councillor Thorpe's words, I believe he said must have or needs, or words to that effect. But I just want to say, as a member of this council, I'm pleased to see council considering very seriously all of these projects. Some are absolutely necessary, and they are our responsibility. They are no one else's. They're not going to be delivered by some form of senior government. And it's our job to do them, and I think we should be talking about doing it and letting citizens have a say, if you will, through the various processes, and I think it's becoming fairly obvious what those are going to be. In order, Councillor Hemmons and then Councillor Manley.
Thank you, Your Worship. I agree with most of what's been said. I definitely agree on the AAP for the first phase of the knock. I could absolutely be convinced for an AAP for the South End. I hadn't thought that in my mind. I was thinking that would be bundled with the referendum for more of a community amenity piece versus the infrastructure that we need to provide. Going back to a previous piece around debt philosophy, I think given that we have these major projects coming down the pipe, it would be silly of us to set a cap on our borrowing when we already, if we get these projects done, we're going to be pretty close to our cap, and we can change that cap at any point. So I'm not a fan of this council saying we don't want to go above, say, 28%. I think it's project by project, and that's kind of our job. And if the next council wants to set a limit, that's their business. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Manley, and then Councillor Perino.
Thank you, Your Worship. Yeah, I would agree. The knock is something we want to take to an AAP. I hadn't considered the South End Community Center for an AAP, but I think it really makes sense in terms of social determinants of health, and you don't want to divide the city based on a referendum. Tying two things together, I think the South End Community Center would have a better chance of coming through a referendum, but at the same time, I think it's a really important project, but it is a long way from North Nanaimo. I want to thank staff for the presentations today. It's very informative. I don't think we need to change our debt cap. I think staff's doing a great job, and we've done a good job of as a city of keeping our debt low, but we also don't want to hamstring ourselves and set targets that when we have a lot of these projects that are important. I don't think we've seen anything in front of us today that's frivolous, that's not something that is either not needed or not wanted by the community. And I think the walkway is an example of something that the community is really interested in, and I think it would do wonders for the city in terms of tourism and connecting the community. I've mentioned this before, but going to communities in California where they have walkways all along the waterfront, it's such an amazing amenity for tourists and for residents. So just want to thank you for the presentation today, and those are my thoughts.
Thank you very much. Councillor Perino.
Thank you, Chair. And I also want to thank staff. I thought this was an excellent presentation this morning. I particularly liked the slide that had where the projects were, lined up to particular years. So, we're not planning to do them all right now, and that was helpful and a bit of a sigh of relief, because the cost, the total cost, of course, is massive. But when you do it over, years, it's not insurmountable. It feels like we're biting the elephant one bite at a time. So I want to say thank you very much for that. And I actually ditto what you had said, Your Worship. I agree wholeheartedly with the AAP for both the knock and the South End Wellness Center and referendum for the walkway. Obviously, the referendum would be early next year, 2024. So yeah, love it. Let's go for it. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Perino. Any further discussion or comments? I mean, this is the moment when staff are looking for some. Sorry, Ms.
I just think
Councillor Gesselbrock, sorry. Your yellow is very obscure against the lovely white of your ceiling.
Yeah, I think how things are, where the debt ceiling is set, is good, and I think the pathway forward on all fronts is well laid out, and I appreciate what staff have laid out here. As for whether bundling the South End with the referendum with the waterfront walkway, I'm somewhat agnostic doing that. I think that it probably would be a similar outcome either way. But I'm not opposed if we just want to make that an AAP as well. And I believe that is all the point staff we're looking for. So
Thank you very much. Councillor Eastmere?
So just through you, Chair, just to clarify, when you say bundling it together, so I was imagining it would be two different questions on the referendum, but you're saying it would actually just be one question, you give a thumbs up to both projects or a thumbs down to both?
Yes, you could do it that way through you, Your Worship, to Councillor Eastmer. It would be combined, if they're similar type projects, you could combine the question together and the borrowing amount together. So for a walkway community amenity and South End Community Center, you would say to the public for their approval, do you agree with borrowing up to $100 million for this and that, yes or no? And so the questions would be combined. So we have done those in the past, I think, for the Nanaimo Aquatic Center yes, so sorry, the convention center and the arenas were combined.
Okay.
Or on the same ballot. So you could do it that way, but it is your choice on the method. So an alternative approval process is completely acceptable should you wish to go that way for the South End Community Center.
Okay, yeah, thank you. I just, I don't see a huge correlation between the two projects. So just to reiterate, and as a voter, I wouldn't love having to say yes or no to both of those projects all in one piece. I think they're really quite different. Thank you.
Sorry, just to be clear, but in a referendum, not the alternative approval process, you could ask separate questions on one referendum. So do you approve of borrowing $40 million for the knock, and do you approve of $38 million for the waterfront walkway? You could have as many questions as you want, as for that matter. Is that fair? Yes.
Through Your Worship, to Your Worship, yes, that's fair. I think 2 questions are allowed on a ballot, and then you would have to have other additional ballots, but you could have additional ballots at the same referendum. I think strategically, some would want to combine a question, like one question, for the greater opportunity to get approval. So there is some strategy possibly involved as well.
And of course, it's that very strategy that will be criticized by whatever we do. Some, if we put it in one question, will be saying we're trying to force people to support our favorite project because they don't want to turn down theirs, et cetera, et cetera. It's always challenging politically. Councillor Gesselbrock, is that your hand just staying up, or do you have a new question or comment?
No, I do have a new question. Just in terms of, do we need, if we say we did an AAP for the South End Center, do we need to change any policy around what triggers the like currently, is there a policy saying that if something is above a certain level of borrowing, we can't just do an AAP, we have to go to referendum? Do we have to change that threshold, or is it an option?
Your Worship, through you to Councillor Gesselbrock, there's no policy right now, so the legislation is what we're referring to, and the threshold for borrowing is for long-term borrowing. So anything that is over 5 years, and Ms. Mercer can correct me, would be considered long-term borrowing. And long-term borrowing requires approval of the electors, and approval of the electors can be obtained either by alternative approval process or referendum. So there's no threshold for you can't do AAP, you have to do referendum, or vice versa. You can, as a council, choose which process you prefer to do.
Okay, interesting. So it is really a matter of our interpretation of what we see as a additional community amenity or a community necessity. What area, what direction it goes in.
Exactly. It's there's best practices and considerations, but it's ultimately up to council what method you go forward with.
Yeah, I think, me personally, I think, just reflecting on it, we're committed to the South End Community Center and agree on the need that keep it an AAP. I think a referendum just unnecessarily muddies the water. Thanks.
Thank you very much. As I was saying earlier, you know, staff are looking for, I won't call it not direction this morning, but certainly some guidance. Is there anything anyone else wants to say with respect to the three topics, if I can call them that, reminding us that do we want a draft, do we want a debt management policy? Would you see it as necessary on the capital projects? I think there seems to be some general interest in all of them. In terms of the approval of the electors, that's more of an educational exercise, and I want to thank staff for that. That was well done and very helpful for folks, and also helpful for the public who are listening this morning, I trust and hope, and any reporters who may be interested in this. Any further comments from anyone? If not, I want to express thanks to all of staff who participated and supported the presentations this morning. I think it's been a very useful morning, and I am quite serious when I say I hope that as much of the public was listening as is possible. These are, this is where the real money hits the road, or the rubber hits the road, and we're talking, you know, potentially up to $380 million in borrowing based on speculative figures today for things, some of which some will see as absolutely necessary, and I think many of us do, and others will see as discretionary and not necessarily important for the city, but that will be decided at during future discussions. So again, thank you, everyone. If there's nothing further, we have no other business that I'm aware of. A motion to adjourn. Moved Councillor Eastmere, seconded Councillor Manley. All those in favor? Any opposed? None. Motion